You're useless now. Daniel is gone. There's no reason for you to stay here, my daughter-in-law said, her voice flat and steady across the dinner table only 3 days after we buried my son. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the silence of the house like dust on polished wood. I remember the way the late afternoon light came through the blinds, cutting thin gold lines across the dining room floor. Daniel had installed those blinds himself 12 years ago, standing on a step ladder in his socks because he said shoes scratched the hardwood. I sat at the head of the table, my hands folded around my cane, the same oak cane my husband had used in his final years. I am 80 years old. My hair is silver, my hands lined and spotted with time, but I have never mistaken age for weakness. Vanessa did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She pushed her plate away, barely touched, and looked at me as if I were a piece of furniture that no longer matched the room. The house is too much for you, she added, and I need space. I nodded once. I did not argue. Grief has a sound. It is not loud. It is the hum of the refrigerator at night, the ticking of a clock that feels too sharp, the hollow space on the couch where your child used to sit, 6 feet tall and laughing. Daniel was 45 when he passed. Too young. A heart that worked too hard for too many years. For a week, this house had been filled with casseroles, paper plates, neighbors whispering condolences in the hallway. Now it was just the two of us and the quiet calculation in her eyes. I picked up my napkin, placed it carefully beside my plate, and stood. It took me a moment to steady myself. My knees do not move as quickly as they once did, but they still carry me where I choose to go. I walked down the hallway lined with framed photographs. Daniel at 8 years old holding a Little League trophy. Daniel at 16 with his first car. Daniel on his wedding day, smiling beside Vanessa in a cream-colored dress under the bright California sun. I paused at that one for half a breath. Then I kept walking. In my bedroom, I closed the door softly. I did not cry. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house settle. There is a difference between being unwanted and being underestimated. I have learned that over 80 years. That night, I folded my black dress from the funeral and placed it back in the closet. I laid out a navy suit instead. The next morning, before Vanessa came downstairs, I made myself a cup of coffee, strong and without sugar, and stepped out onto the front porch. The air was cool, about 58 degrees, the kind of early spring morning that smells faintly of cut grass and wet pavement. I watched the sun rise over the quiet street we had lived on for 3 decades. Then I called a car service. At 9 o'clock sharp, I walked into Whitmore and Green Financial with my cane tapping lightly against the marble floor. The receptionist's eyes widened in recognition. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, standing immediately. I gave her a small smile. "Good morning, Claire. I'd like to review my accounts." Behind me, the glass doors closed with a soft click. Vanessa believed I was an old woman with nowhere to go. She believed grief had emptied me. What she did not understand was that long before she ever stepped into this house, long before Daniel learned to ride a bike on this very street, I had built things with my own hands that did not disappear when someone decided I was inconvenient. And that was something she was about to discover. When I returned from Whitmore and Green Financial that afternoon, the house looked exactly the same, and yet it felt smaller, as if the walls had inched closer together overnight. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 o'clock, each note clear and steady, unconcerned with human grief. Vanessa was in the kitchen, standing at the island with her laptop open, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. She glanced up when she heard my cane against the tile. There was a brief flicker in her eyes, something between curiosity and irritation. "You were out early," she said. I set my handbag on the side table by the stairs. "I had an appointment." She nodded but did not ask where. She did not need to know. The refrigerator door was covered with sympathy cards, most of them addressed to her. The ones addressed to me were stacked neatly on the corner of the counter, tied together with a pale blue ribbon I had found in the drawer. I untied them later in my room and read each one slowly. People wrote about Daniel's kindness, about the way he stayed late at the office to help younger employees, about the way he called me every Sunday evening without fail. They did not write about how the house felt now, how the air itself seemed to carry a quiet evaluation of my usefulness. Over the next few days, small things shifted. The framed photograph of me and Daniel at the Grand Canyon, taken 8 years ago during a trip he insisted on planning, disappeared from the mantel and was replaced with a larger portrait of Vanessa and Daniel from their anniversary dinner. My favorite armchair, the one positioned near the front window where the light is best in the mornings, was moved slightly to the side to make space for a tall decorative plant I did not recognize. When I asked about it, she smiled politely and said she was refreshing the room. I noticed that my name was no longer included in conversations about the future. One evening, while she was speaking on the phone in the living room, I heard my address described as if I were not standing 10 feet away. It is a 4-bedroom colonial on Maple Street, she said. Plenty of square footage. It will show beautifully once it is staged. I stood in the hallway and listened to the confidence in her tone. She was not grieving in the way I was. Her sorrow had already begun to reorganize itself into plans. That night, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed and ran my hand over the documents I had placed there years ago, sealed in a leather folder. My late husband believed in preparation. He used to say that security is not about money alone, but about knowledge. I thought about Daniel at 7 years old, running through the sprinkler in the backyard on a humid July afternoon, laughing as the water soaked through his red shirt. I thought about the way he looked the day he signed his first contract at the firm, proud and slightly overwhelmed, asking me if his tie was straight. The boy, who once needed help tying his shoes, had grown into a man who believed he was protecting me. He never imagined that protection would need to move in the opposite direction. The following morning, Vanessa knocked on my bedroom door. She did not wait for my answer before stepping inside. I have been researching assisted living communities, she said, holding a glossy brochure between her fingers. They have activities, transportation, medical support. It would be safer for you. I closed the book I was reading and looked at her steadily. Safer for whom? I asked. She hesitated for half a second, then recovered with a measured smile. For you, of course. I placed my glasses on the nightstand. I have managed this home for over 30 years, I said. I am quite capable of managing myself. She shifted her weight, impatience creeping into her posture. Things are different now, she replied. Daniel handled most of it. I let the silence stretch between us. There are moments when the truth does not need to be spoken aloud because it is already standing in the room. She believed the foundation of this house had been my son. She did not understand that the foundation had been laid long before he ever signed his name to a document. Beside him, pointing, explaining. When she came inside, she handed me a single new key. Do not lose it, she said lightly. It is expensive to replace. I held the key in my palm. It felt colder than the old one. That evening, she hosted 2 friends for dinner. I stayed in my room at first, reading beneath the soft glow of my bedside lamp, but their laughter carried easily through the thin hallway. At one point, I stepped out to pour myself a glass of water. The conversation faltered when I entered the kitchen. One of the women offered me a polite smile. Vanessa cleared her throat. This is Margaret, she said. Not mother. Not mother-in-law. Just Margaret. She is staying with me for a while. Staying. As if I had arrived with a suitcase and no history. I did not correct her. I poured my water, the ice cubes clinking against the glass, and returned to my room. The following morning, I discovered that several of Daniel's old files were missing from the study. The shelves looked cleaner, almost staged. When I asked where they had gone, Vanessa shrugged. I am simplifying, she said. There is no reason to hold on to everything. I walked into the study after she left for the day and ran my fingers along the empty space where the leather-bound folders had once stood. Dust outlined their former presence, a faint shadow of what used to be. It is remarkable how quickly someone can attempt to erase a legacy when they believe they have inherited it. On Wednesday afternoon, I overheard another phone call. I was in the hallway again, my cane resting against the wall as I adjusted a picture frame. Yes, she was saying, her tone brisk. Once the paperwork clears, I will have full control. It is just a matter of time. There was confidence in her voice, a certainty that suggested she believed the outcome was already decided. I returned to my bedroom and opened the leather folder inside the cedar chest. The documents were intact, each page crisp, each signature deliberate. I reviewed them slowly, line by line, the way my husband taught me decades ago at our dining room table with a yellow legal pad between us. Knowledge is quiet power. That evening, Vanessa knocked again without waiting. We need to talk about timelines. She said, I cannot move forward until certain things are resolved. I looked up at her from my chair by the window. What things? I asked. She folded her arms. Ownership. Authority. Decision-making. I studied her face, the impatience barely concealed beneath a layer of practiced composure. She believed she was being efficient, strategic, practical. What she did not see was that every small exclusion, every altered lock, every careful reintroduction of me as a temporary presence was revealing more than she intended. She thought she was tightening her control. In truth, she was clarifying her assumptions. And assumptions, when built on incomplete information, have a way of collapsing under their own weight. On Thursday morning I woke before sunrise, the way I often do now, when the house is at its most honest. There is a certain clarity in the hour before 6 o'clock, when even ambition is still asleep. I sat up slowly, placed my feet into my slippers, and rested my hands on the carved handle of my cane. For a moment I listened to the quiet, and allowed myself to remember a different version of this house. Daniel used to wake early as a boy, padding down the hallway in oversized pajamas, asking if it was time for pancakes even when it was only 5:30 in the morning. He was impatient with time back then, eager to grow, eager to become. I would stand at this same stove, flipping pancakes while sunlight spilled across the counter, and he would sit swinging his legs, telling me about dreams that made no sense but felt important. I remember the first time he told me he wanted to go into finance. He was 17, tall and serious, holding a brochure from a business school in Illinois. He said he wanted to build something solid, something that lasted. His father smiled that quiet smile of approval and told him that real strength is not loud. It is steady. Years later, when Daniel signed his partnership agreement at Whitmore and Green Financial, he asked me to sit beside him at the long mahogany conference table. The contract was thick, nearly 100 pages, printed on heavy cream paper. He looked at me before he signed and said, "This is because of you." I corrected him gently. "This is because of us." I was there in the early years. When the firm operated out of a modest office above a hardware store, when your father and I reviewed accounts at our own dining table with nothing more than a calculator and a yellow legal pad. I handled client correspondence, managed scheduling, and met with families who trusted us with their savings. We built that company together, brick by brick, client by client. Daniel grew into it, just as he grew into his suits, his voice deepening, his handshake firm. He believed he was stepping into something new. In truth, he was stepping into something that had already been carefully constructed. By the time Vanessa entered his life, the firm had expanded into a glass building downtown, with polished floors and a reception desk that reflected the city skyline. She admired the success. She admired the title on his business card. I do not fault her for that. Ambition is not a flaw, but ambition without understanding can become dangerous. As I sat in my bedroom that morning, watching the pale light creep across the quilt at the foot of my bed, I realized that Vanessa had only ever known the finished structure. She never saw the years when we drove an aging sedan with over 100,000 miles on it, because every spare dollar was reinvested into the firm. She never saw the nights when I balanced spreadsheets long after Daniel had gone to bed, determined to ensure that payroll cleared on time. She saw the outcome and mistook it for inheritance rather than effort. Downstairs, I heard her moving through the kitchen, cabinet doors opening and closing with brisk efficiency. The rhythm of her steps carried confidence, perhaps even impatience. She believed that control was already shifting into her hands. I rose from my chair and walked to the mirror. The woman reflected back at me was 80 years old, yes. Her shoulders were slightly bent, her hair entirely silver. But her eyes were clear. They held decades of memory, of contracts signed, of risks taken, of promises kept. Daniel once told me that I was the strongest person he knew, not because I spoke the loudest, but because I endured the longest. I picked up the leather folder once more and held it firmly. There are seasons in life when silence protects you, and seasons when silence prepares you. I had been silent long enough, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that the foundation of this house and the foundation of that firm downtown had never rested solely on my son. It rested on me. That afternoon, I did something I had not done in years. I called Howard Green directly. I did not leave a message with his assistant. I did not send an email. I dialed his private office number from memory, the same number I had used decades ago when the firm consisted of only 3 employees and a second-hand copier that jammed every other week. He answered on the third ring. His voice sounded older, of course, but steady. Margaret, he said, and there was a pause filled with recognition rather than surprise. I was expecting your call. I did not waste time on pleasantries. I would like to schedule a formal review, I told him. In person. He understood immediately. We agreed on Friday at 10 o'clock. When I hung up, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. Not sorrow. Clarity. That evening, Vanessa was unusually cheerful. She set the dining table with matching placemats and even lit a candle, as if we were honoring a celebration rather than navigating a transition. I met with a realtor today, she said lightly as she served herself grilled chicken and steamed vegetables. Just to explore options. I folded my napkin carefully across my lap. Options can be useful, I replied. She smiled, mistaking my composure for agreement. The market is strong, she continued. Homes in this neighborhood are selling above asking price. It would be smart to move quickly. I took a small sip of water and studied her face. There was no cruelty in her expression, only calculation. She believed she was being practical, efficient. She believed time was on her side. And the firm? I asked gently. Have you considered how that will be managed? She waved her hand dismissively. Daniel structured everything well. His shares transfer to me. It is straightforward. Straightforward. I almost admired her confidence. After dinner, she remained in the kitchen, speaking again on her phone. I did not intend to listen, but the hallway carries sound too easily. Yes, she said, her tone lower now. Once the estate clears probate, I will have majority control. Margaret does not really understand how these things work. I stood very still. The assumption in her voice was not malicious. It was simply uninformed. She believed age equaled ignorance. She believed grief equaled weakness. The next morning I dressed in my navy suit again, the one tailored years ago when I still attended quarterly meetings downtown. I brushed my hair neatly back and fastened a small pearl brooch at my collar, a gift from my husband on our 40th anniversary. When I entered the kitchen, Vanessa looked up from her coffee. You look dressed up, she observed. I have business to attend to, I said. She hesitated, then shrugged. Do not overexert yourself. The drive downtown felt familiar, almost comforting. The city skyline rose against a clear blue sky, the glass facade of Whitmore and Green Financial reflecting sunlight in sharp angles. When I stepped through the revolving door, several younger associates glanced up, their expressions shifting from surprise to respect. Howard was waiting in the conference room. The same long mahogany table. The same leather chairs. He stood when I entered. Margaret, he said again, and this time there was gravity in his voice. I placed the leather folder on the table between us. It is time, I told him. We reviewed the trust documents carefully, page by page, confirming what had always been true. The controlling interest in the firm had never transferred fully to Daniel. It had been placed into a family trust decades ago, structured with specific conditions and oversight. My signature remained active. My authority remained intact. By the time I left the building, the sun was high overhead, the air a mild 65 degrees. I walked slowly to the waiting car, feeling neither triumphant nor anxious. Just certain. Vanessa believed she was preparing to take control of assets that had always belonged to her through marriage. She did not yet understand that what she was standing on was not a gift. It was a foundation built by hands she had underestimated. And foundations, when tested, reveal who truly holds the weight. When I returned home from the meeting with Howard, I did not announce where I had been. I placed my handbag in its usual spot and set the leather folder back inside the cedar chest beneath my winter blankets. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish, sharper than usual. Vanessa had been busy. The dining room table was cleared of everything except a single decorative bowl filled with artificial white orchids. The family photographs were fewer now. Clean lines. Clean surfaces. A home preparing to be presented. She was seated at the kitchen island with a stack of documents spread neatly before her, a pen in her hand, her posture confident. She looked up as I entered. I scheduled an appointment with the estate attorney next week, she said without preamble. We should finalize everything. I removed my gloves slowly, placing them beside my handbag. Everything is not as simple as you think, I replied. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Daniel made me his beneficiary, she said. I have the paperwork. Her voice carried certainty, but beneath it I detected something else. Urgency. I walked to the cabinet, retrieved a teacup, and poured hot water over a bag of chamomile. Steam rose gently between us. Beneficiary, I repeated softly, is not the same as controlling partner. She frowned slightly. What does that mean? I met her gaze steadily. It means there are structures in place that existed long before you entered this family. The silence that followed was different from the others we had shared. This one was edged with doubt. She set her pen down. Are you saying Daniel did not leave me what is mine? I considered my words carefully. I am saying that Daniel honored agreements that were made decades ago. She stood then, pacing a few steps across the kitchen tile. No one explained any of this to me, she said, her voice rising just enough to reveal her frustration. I have been preparing based on what I was told. I sipped my tea. Preparation without full information can lead to disappointment. She stopped pacing and looked at me as if seeing me for the first time not as a grieving widow, but as an obstacle. So what are you planning to do? She asked. I rested both hands on the handle of my cane. I am planning to protect what your father-in-law and I built. She inhaled sharply. You think I am trying to take something from you? I did not answer directly. Instead I said, this house, this firm, this legacy, they were never accidents. The afternoon light filtered through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the floor. I could see calculations forming behind her eyes, adjusting to a new reality she had not anticipated. For weeks, she had moved through this home as though transition were inevitable, as though my presence were temporary and her authority assured. Now uncertainty had entered the room. That evening she made several phone calls behind closed doors. I heard her footsteps upstairs, measured and restless. The following morning, I found a new envelope placed neatly on the dining table addressed to me in her handwriting. Inside was a printed summary of what she believed to be the estate distribution, highlighted in yellow. Assumptions clearly marked as facts. I read it carefully, then folded it once and set it aside. She wanted clarity. She would have it, but not on her terms. On Monday, Howard would send formal notices outlining the structure of the trust and the limitations attached to Daniel's shares. The documents would be precise, undeniable. I moved to the living room and stood by the front window, watching a delivery truck pass slowly down Maple Street. The world outside continued as it always had. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. A neighbor trimmed his hedges. Life does not pause for internal power shifts. I felt no anger toward Vanessa, only a steady resolve. She believed she was stepping into ownership. She was about to learn the difference between inheritance and stewardship. And she was about to understand that I had never been a guest in this house. Monday arrived with a stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the house itself understood that something unseen was about to shift. I woke before dawn again and dressed with care, choosing a charcoal gray suit this time and a simple strand of pearls. I moved slowly, not because I was uncertain, but because I have learned that measured movements unsettle those who expect hesitation. When I stepped into the kitchen, Vanessa was already seated at the island, her phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. She looked up, her expression guarded. The estate attorney confirmed our meeting for Wednesday, she said. We will settle the remaining questions then. I nodded once. That will not be necessary, I replied. She lowered her phone. What do you mean? Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. The sound cut cleanly through the room. Vanessa frowned and rose from her chair. Are you expecting someone? She asked. Yes, I said calmly. She walked to the front door and opened it to find a uniformed courier holding a certified envelope. Delivery for Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, he said. She hesitated, then turned toward me. I walked to the doorway, my cane steady against the hardwood floor, and signed my name with deliberate strokes. The courier nodded politely and left. I did not open the envelope immediately. I carried it back to the dining table and sat down. Vanessa remained standing, her arms crossed tightly. What is that? She demanded. I broke the seal and unfolded the documents inside. The letterhead of Whitmore and Green Financial was clear at the top. Formal clarification of trust structure and controlling interest, I read aloud softly. Her jaw tightened. What trust? I slid the first page across the table toward her. The Whitmore Family Trust, I said. Established 32 years ago. She scanned the lines quickly, her eyes moving faster with each paragraph. This says you retain majority voting rights, she said, her voice losing its earlier certainty. It says Daniel was managing partner, not controlling partner. I folded my hands. That is correct. She shook her head. That does not make sense. He told me everything would transfer to me. I met her gaze steadily. Daniel honored the structure your father-in-law and I created. His shares were always subject to trust conditions. Those conditions remain. The kitchen felt smaller now, not because the walls had moved, but because the air had changed. Confidence had drained from her posture, replaced by calculation of a different kind. "So what does this mean for me?" she asked quietly. I did not rush my answer. "It means you are a beneficiary," I said. "You will receive financial distributions as outlined. But you do not have authority to sell the firm. You do not have authority to liquidate assets. And you do not have authority to sell this house." Her head snapped up. "The house." I nodded. "The deed was transferred into the trust 15 years ago. You assumed Daniel owned it outright. He did not." She sank slowly into the chair across from me, the documents trembling slightly in her hands. For weeks, she had moved with certainty, rearranging rooms, calling realtors, speaking of timelines as if they were hers to command. Now the ground beneath her assumptions had shifted. "Why did no one tell me?" she whispered. I considered that carefully. "Because no one asked the right questions," I said. Silence filled the space between us. Not the quiet of grief. Not the quiet of dismissal. The quiet of realization. Outside, a lawn mower hummed faintly from a neighbor's yard. A car passed along Maple Street. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. I leaned back in my chair, my hands resting lightly on my cane. "You believed I was dependent," I said evenly. "You believed my presence here was temporary." She did not respond. She could not. The documents lay open on the table, undeniable and precise. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply allowed the truth to sit in front of her. Power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits patiently until it is challenged. And when it speaks, it does so without anger, without haste, and without apology. Vanessa did not speak for a long time after reading the documents. She remained seated at the dining table, her shoulders slightly curved forward, the pages spread before her like evidence she had not prepared to face. I did not rush her. I have learned that silence, when allowed to breathe, does more work than argument ever could. Finally she looked up. "You could have told me," she said, her voice lower now, stripped of the earlier sharpness. I folded my hands calmly. "You did not ask," I replied. She exhaled slowly, glancing around the room as if seeing it differently. The polished hardwood floors. The crown molding Daniel's father installed himself. The long hallway lined with family photographs that she had begun to replace. For weeks, she had moved through this house as if it were already hers to direct. Now every detail carried a different weight. "What happens now?" she asked. The question was no longer confrontational. It was uncertain. I considered my answer carefully. "Now," I said evenly, "we move forward with clarity." That afternoon she canceled her appointment with the realtor. I overheard the call from the living room. Her tone was polite but firm. "There have been developments," she said. "We are postponing." Developments. It was an interesting choice of words. Later, she approached me while I was seated by the front window. The late sun cast a soft glow across the carpet, warming the room in a way it had not seemed to do for weeks. "I did not realize you were still that involved," she said. There was no accusation in her voice now, only recalibration. I looked out at Maple Street where a child was learning to ride a bicycle, wobbling slightly before finding balance. "I was never uninvolved," I answered. "You simply assumed the structure ended with Daniel." She stood quietly beside my chair. "He made it sound like everything was simple," she said. "He wanted to protect you." I smiled faintly. "He did protect me, by honoring the agreements we made long ago." That evening the atmosphere in the house shifted again, not back to warmth, but away from dismissal. Vanessa prepared dinner without speaking much. She placed a plate in front of me and sat across from me rather than at the far end of the table. The distance between us, though still present, was no longer reinforced by certainty. "I have responsibilities too," she said after a few minutes. "Bills. The firm. Expectations." I nodded. "And you will continue to meet them," I replied. "But not by dismantling what sustains them." She absorbed that quietly. The next morning she removed the artificial orchids from the dining table and returned several of the framed photographs to the mantel. I noticed without commenting. Respect does not always arrive with apology. Sometimes it arrives with small corrections. In the days that followed, formal notices were sent to the firm's board members outlining the trust's authority structure. I received confirmation from Howard that all voting procedures would proceed according to the original charter. Vanessa received copies as well. She did not contest them. Instead, she began asking questions. Careful questions. About distribution schedules. About reporting obligations. About her role moving forward. I answered when necessary, and when the matter required detail, I referred her to Howard. I did not seek to embarrass her. I sought to stabilize what she had nearly unsettled. One afternoon she stood in the doorway of the study, the same room she had begun to clear weeks earlier. I underestimated you, she said quietly. I did not look up from the document in my hands. You underestimated history, I corrected gently. The room fell silent again, but this silence carried something new. Not dominance. Not defeat. Recognition. Outside, the sky deepened toward evening, soft blue fading into gold. The house felt steadier now, as if the foundation itself had exhaled. Vanessa believed she had been preparing for ownership. She was beginning to understand that stewardship requires humility, and I remained exactly where I had always been, not as a guest, not as an obstacle, but as the foundation she had failed to see. The week after the formal notices were delivered, the firm held its quarterly board meeting downtown. It was the first one since Daniel passed, and the atmosphere carried a quiet weight that no polished conference table could disguise. I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always have. The elevator ride to the 12th floor was smooth, the soft hum of machinery steady beneath my feet. When the doors opened, several board members looked up in visible surprise. I had not attended every meeting in recent years, but my presence had never required explanation. I walked into the conference room with my cane resting lightly against my palm and took my usual seat near the head of the table. Vanessa entered shortly after, dressed in a tailored black suit, her posture composed but tighter than before. She glanced at me briefly, then took her place across from Howard. The meeting began with routine reports, revenue projections, client retention numbers, market adjustments. I listened without interruption, noting the familiar rhythm of financial language I have heard for more than 3 decades. When the agenda reached voting procedures for the upcoming fiscal adjustments, Howard cleared his throat. Before we proceed, he said calmly, we must reaffirm the controlling authority as outlined in the Whitmore Family Trust. Several heads turned in my direction. Vanessa's fingers tightened slightly around her pen. Howard continued, methodical and precise, outlining the structure we had established years ago. Majority voting rights retained by the trust. Oversight provisions requiring my signature for any significant asset liquidation. Conditions that ensured stability rather than impulsive restructuring. The words were not dramatic. They did not need to be. They were facts. One of the senior partners leaned back in his chair and nodded. That aligns with the original charter, he said. Vanessa inhaled slowly. I was under the impression that Daniel's shares transferred fully to me, she said, her tone controlled. Howard responded evenly. They transferred in accordance with the trust conditions. Those conditions remained binding. The room was quiet, but not tense. It was the quiet of clarification. For a moment, I studied Vanessa's face. The confidence she once carried so effortlessly had been replaced with concentration. She was recalculating, not resisting. Then I would like a clear outline of my responsibilities moving forward, she said finally. I admired that response. It was measured, practical. Howard slid a folder toward her, detailing distribution schedules and managerial roles within defined limits. She reviewed it carefully, asking pointed questions, not emotional ones, strategic ones. I spoke only when necessary. The goal has always been continuity, I said. This firm was built to outlast any one of us. The board members nodded in agreement. Continuity is comforting in uncertain times. By the end of the meeting, voting procedures were reaffirmed under the trust's authority. No assets would be sold. No abrupt restructuring would occur. Stability had prevailed. As we gathered our documents, Vanessa paused beside my chair. You could have embarrassed me, she said quietly. I looked up at her. That was never my intention. She held my gaze for a moment longer than usual. I see that now. When I left the building, the late afternoon sun reflected sharply off the glass facade, casting bright patterns onto the sidewalk. The air was cool, just under 60 degrees, crisp enough to carry the scent of autumn beginning to approach. I felt no triumph, no satisfaction in correction, only steadiness. Back at the house on Maple Street, the atmosphere had shifted yet again. The tension that once filled the hallways had thinned into something more balanced. Vanessa no longer spoke of timelines for selling. She no longer referred to me as temporary. That evening she placed 2 cups of tea on the coffee table without being asked. Small gestures, subtle acknowledgments. The foundation had held, not because it fought, not because it shouted, but because it was built correctly from the beginning. And in that steadiness, something unexpected began to grow. Not reconciliation, not yet, but respect. In the days following the board meeting, the house on Maple Street settled into a new rhythm. It was subtle at first. Doors closed more gently. Conversations paused before assumptions were made. Vanessa began leaving the study door open instead of shutting it firmly as she once had. I noticed these things because I have always noticed what shifts beneath the surface. One afternoon she asked if I would review a client proposal with her. The request was straightforward, almost businesslike. We sat at the dining table where weeks earlier she had spoken of timelines and sales as if they were already decided. Now there were spreadsheets between us instead of real estate brochures. I want to make sure I handle this correctly, she said. I adjusted my glasses and read through the figures carefully. The proposal involved a long-term investment strategy for a family who had been clients for over 20 years. I recognized the name immediately. I remembered when they first came to us, young and uncertain, carrying a folder of modest savings and large hopes. They value stability, I said quietly. Do not move them toward aggressive growth simply because the market is strong. They trusted Daniel because he honored consistency. She nodded slowly, taking notes. For the first time since his passing, his name did not create distance between us. It created common ground. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and painted the living room in soft amber light, Vanessa stood beside the mantel where she had once replaced my photograph. She picked up the frame of Daniel and me at the Grand Canyon and held it for a moment. He never told me how much you were involved, she said. I remained seated in my armchair, my cane resting against my knee. He did not need to, I replied. He believed what we built would speak for itself. She turned the frame slightly, studying Daniel's smile. I thought I was stepping into something fully formed, she admitted. I did not realize I was stepping into something still guided. I considered her words. Leadership does not disappear because someone passes, I said gently. It transitions. Carefully. The following week we attended a small client appreciation luncheon at the firm. I had not planned to go, but Vanessa asked if I would join her. The event was modest, held in the conference room with catered sandwiches and coffee, served in porcelain cups rather than paper. As we moved through the room greeting clients, I could sense their curiosity. They had heard about Daniel. They had heard about changes. Stability matters to people who entrust their life savings to others. Vanessa introduced me not as Margaret, not as someone staying temporarily, but as the co-founder of the firm and trustee of the family trust. The words were clear, deliberate. I saw the shift in the room immediately. Shoulders relaxed. Conversations deepened. Afterward, as we rode the elevator down together, she spoke quietly. They trust you, she said. They trust the history. I looked at our reflections in the mirrored wall. An 80-year-old woman with silver hair and steady eyes. A younger woman adjusting to responsibility she had not fully understood. Trust is earned slowly, I said, and protected carefully. When we returned home that evening, Vanessa did something she had not done in months. She set the dining table with 3 plates instead of 2. For a brief second my breath caught before I realized the 3rd plate was symbolic. She removed it gently, then smiled faintly at her own mistake. I suppose habits take time to change, she said. I nodded. So do perceptions. The house felt different now, not because authority had been asserted, but because it had been recognized. Grief still lingered in quiet corners, but it no longer fueled ambition. It tempered it. Vanessa had begun to understand that legacy is not something you claim. It is something you are invited to uphold. And I remained where I had always been, steady at the center, not demanding control, but embodying it. Autumn settled fully over Maple Street by the time the next board cycle approached. The maple trees lining the sidewalk turned a deep amber, their leaves drifting down in quiet spirals that collected along the curb. I watched them from the front window one morning, my hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee, and thought about how seasons change without asking permission. Inside the house, the air no longer carried tension. It carried adjustment. Vanessa had begun rising earlier, reviewing reports at the kitchen table with a seriousness that felt different from ambition. It felt earned. One evening she approached me while I was organizing old documents in the study. The room still smelled faintly of leather and polished wood, the same scent it had carried for decades. "I want to understand the original charter more deeply," she said, "not just the summaries." I looked up at her and gestured to the chair across from me. "Then you should read it from the beginning," I replied. I handed her the original binder, its edges worn but intact. She ran her fingers over the cover with an expression that was no longer impatient. It was reflective. We spent the next hour reviewing clauses that Daniel once studied as a young man, clauses that defined responsibility, succession, and stewardship. "He signed this knowing he would not have full control," she said quietly. "Yes," I answered. "He believed in continuity more than authority." She closed the binder slowly. "And you trusted him with management because he respected that structure." I nodded. Trust is not the absence of oversight. It is alignment with shared values. The conversation was calm, steady, without accusation. For the first time since Daniel's passing, his absence felt less like a fracture and more like a bridge between us. A few days later, Vanessa requested a joint meeting with Howard to discuss long-term planning. Not liquidation, not sale, planning. In the conference room downtown, she spoke clearly about preserving the firm's culture, about honoring existing clients rather than chasing rapid expansion. I listened carefully. When she finished, several partners nodded in agreement. Howard glanced at me briefly. I gave a small, approving inclination of my head. After the meeting, as we walked toward the elevator, Vanessa slowed her pace to match mine. "I owe you an apology," she said. The words were simple, direct. I did not interrupt. "I let fear make me impatient," she continued. "I thought if I did not take control immediately, everything would slip away." I considered her confession thoughtfully. "Grief often disguises itself as urgency," I said. "You were trying to secure what you thought was fragile." She looked at me with a steadiness I had not seen before. "I misjudged you." I held her gaze. "You mistook silence for weakness," I said gently. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. As we stepped inside, the mirrored walls reflected two women standing side by side. Different ages, different experiences, connected by legacy rather than conflict. Back at the house that evening, Vanessa placed fresh flowers on the dining table. Not artificial ones this time. Real white lilies with a subtle fragrance that filled the room. She set 2 plates and paused. "Would you like to say grace?" she asked quietly. It had been years since anyone had asked me that. I folded my hands and spoke softly, thanking God for guidance, for stability, and for the strength to learn. When I finished, she nodded with quiet respect. The house felt whole again, not unchanged, but balanced. Authority had been clarified, assumptions had been corrected, and in that clarity, something stronger than control had taken root. Not dominance, not rivalry, but understanding. Winter arrived quietly that year, dusting Maple Street with a thin layer of frost that shimmered beneath the early morning sun. I stood by the front window one December morning, my hands resting lightly on my cane, and watched as Vanessa brushed snow from the walkway with careful, deliberate strokes. The air outside was crisp, just below 35 degrees, the kind that carries stillness rather than harshness. The house behind me felt warm, settled, not because nothing had changed, but because what needed to change had already done so. A few months earlier I had been told, calmly and without hesitation, that I was no longer needed. I remember the weight of those words, not because they wounded me, but because they revealed something important. They revealed how easily silence can be mistaken for absence, how quickly experience can be dismissed when it is wrapped in age. Now, as I watched Vanessa pause at the end of the driveway and look back toward the house, I saw something different in her expression. Not calculation, not urgency, awareness. She came inside with chilled cheeks and set her gloves on the radiator to dry. "The sidewalk is clear," she said softly. I nodded. "Thank you." We moved through the kitchen together, preparing breakfast in quiet coordination. She sliced fruit while I set the table. There was no longer distance between us measured in authority. There was partnership measured in understanding. Later that afternoon, we drove to the firm for the final meeting of the year. The office was decorated modestly for the holidays, a simple evergreen wreath hanging near the reception desk. Clients greeted us warmly. Staff members spoke of steady growth and stable projections. The firm had not fractured. The house had not been sold. Nothing had collapsed as she once feared. Stability, I have learned, rarely requires loud defense. It requires quiet conviction. After the meeting, Vanessa lingered in the conference room while I gathered my papers. I have been thinking about what you said, she told me. About silence. I looked at her steadily. Silence can mean surrender, she continued. But it can also mean strength. I inclined my head slightly. Strength does not always announce itself, I said. Sometimes it waits to be recognized. She walked with me to the elevator, matching her pace to mine without needing to be asked. When we stepped out into the cold evening air, she glanced up at the illuminated windows of the building. He would be proud, she said quietly. I did not ask who she meant. I knew. Back at the house that night, I sat in my armchair near the front window once more. Snow began to fall again, light and steady. Vanessa placed a blanket over my shoulders without a word. I rested my hand briefly over hers. The house felt steady beneath us, as it always had. I am 80 years old. My steps are slower. My hair is silver. But I have never been useless. I have been a builder, a guardian, a witness to seasons that come and go without permission. The foundation of this home, and the foundation of that firm downtown, did not disappear when my son did. It remained. And in remaining, it taught something important. Age is not the end of relevance. Silence is not the absence of power. And legacy, when built with care, does not need to shout to be felt. It simply stands.